That was awesome, right? I think I spoke to Alex earlier. I guess I'm going to cover a little bit of my talk of just like how you can spot really good vendors, and I think that was just like the passion there, and you could see they had like an infinite game mindset. So yeah, that was awesome. But now for something a bit different. So yeah, thanks everyone for having me. Today I'm going to be talking about well, everything really. I'm going to try and get through as much ground as I can in the next 20-25 minutes to sort of like touch many different bases in the past sort of 10, 12 years that I've been working on AI and ML and banking across the world. So I've worked in sort of China, India, Middle East, America, Europe and the UK, in multiple languages. So I've kind of worked in the trenches with the guys, trying to roll out the same projects and encountering the same problems. So hopefully there'll be some sort of holistic knowledge that I can give you guys that may or may not shape your kind of roadmap moving forward. But kind of like to pick on that bone, I came here like 8 or 9 years ago, and I did a 5-year roadmap, and I've done them in multiple conferences around the world. You'll find my material online. Don't expect a new one, not just from me, but from anyone. As you're all quite well aware, the market has changed dramatically, right? So rather than me sort of give you sort of like frilly, you know, what are the next best ML frameworks, or like what are the up and coming like fintech companies, I think what's going to be more valuable, because you get enough of that in your feeds anyway, right? Like it's a really mature industry. When I did this 10 years ago, I came up on the stage and other stages, and a lot of people had no idea what was going on. There's a lot of fresh faces, but even from the questions that I've seen here, like people are a little bit more clued up on the sort of right questions to ask. So I think what's going to be really more valuable to you guys is me just to sort of share stories that I've seen in the industry across the world, share my experiences and those of others, and it may or may not like kind of like crystallize your vision or not. But I make no mistakes for talking at 100 miles per hour because I've got a lot of content to go through, and I had to cut out a lot of slides out of this. So starting with leadership, it's not really something I wanted to do, but we kind of have to. If a lot of you guys might be aware of Simon Sinek, and what I'm doing is I'm taking his kind of philosophy and I'm peppering it with use cases and real evidence that I've seen. And really kind of like what I'm going to get across here is this common theme that he's been driving is a lot of the business and finance decisions that we make which impact ML development in the space is like from 40, 30 years ago mindset, right? And so it's just no longer working because we're not in the boom years anymore. And so like, I'm not going to go through them all, but we have a lot of challenges that we're encountering, right? And so rather than me just sort of pontificate, let's talk some specific examples. Does anybody know the guy at the bottom? Does he look familiar to anyone? Right, so he was the ex-CEO of Volkswagen. So if you remember the 5 years ago, there was that big emissions scandal. And it was like, you know, they had the software and it was lying about the kind of parts per million pollution. Well, he went to court, right? And then rather than be like, you know, we made a big mistake, he was like, oh, it's those 2 developers, right? So they went to prison, to jail. So fact check me on that because it may have changed. But it turned out that he was totally complicit, right? So this guy kind of signed off on it, and you know, banking gets a bad rep, but I've never seen that done in the finance sector. I've never seen people get held out to dry. This is just what we're facing with, right? So like generally as a leader, like you're paid to take the fall and to represent the company and to protect your employees from stuff like this. But then, okay, does anybody know the guy in the middle? Maybe he might be familiar to more people. So we've got a hand raised. Anybody else? Wow. Okay, so he was the first main influencer of AI and ML in the social space. So about 10 years ago, he was doing all of these YouTube videos, and like every week he was coming out with this like gold content. And people were like, how is this guy producing so much? Well, it turns out he was plagiarizing it all, because the people he was plagiarizing from, they were too busy actually doing stuff than to spend 5 hours doing a YouTube video. Now, I kind of forgive him because he did turn a fresh leaf, but there's a lot of people out there like that today. So, you know, the sort of charlatans in the industry are kind of rife right now. So the pitch I'm going to try and build up here is like, rather than me start and say everything's, you know, sugar and rainbows, I kind of want to point out the pitfalls, because with sort of fresh-faced data scientists here and sort of business CEOs, like rather than you worrying that, you know, the ethical representation of your data set is the be-all and end-all, it's actually more like a single ethical point of failure on a chain of many ethical single points of failure. So don't believe me, let's just go through the track record, right? I mean, I'm not picking out any one individual company here or any one individual like person other than the past two that I just pointed at. What I'm going to do is we're just going to go through the track record. So, because there's an endemic problem to ML, and we have to sort them in chunks. And so the first one is, like, if we look at, like, COVID started, and just prior, the headcount was looking kind of okay. And then we had the first downturn, and they started to kind of do like a hiring freeze, right? So we're going to do hiring freeze, but we'll keep those projects ticking in, right? And then what happened was the sort of next downturn, and fintech, they were like, okay, we're going to need to get rid of, say, 5 people, and we'll put all of that work and resources on the shoulders of one rock star, because that'll definitely work. And then the enterprises were a little bit more sophisticated, right? So they slashed headcount, but they were like, okay, we'll just maintain these toxic service contracts that we've got, and we'll backfill the space with tooling, right? Because then, you know, and we'll maybe pocket 10% on the headcount that we saved. But surprise, surprise, what happened was, and this is like a global thing, so this has like happened everywhere. When there's like the uptick in the economy again, like they were like phoning up, like they were scampering to the recruitment, to HR, to call up people they just fired 12 months ago or 16 months ago, and like, hey, how's it going? Are you looking for a job? And so obviously all they really did was just create an already disloyal employee base, even more disloyal and disgruntled. For those in America and the UK, in the past year alone, 40% of all IT staff changed their job. And I think it was similar in finance as well. So this is kind of like, I'm kind of like trying to build a picture up here of like, before I offer solutions. So what we've got is we've clearly got these bad practices from 40 years ago, right? And so the solution clearly is to be thinking more long term. So and I'm not just going to hit on enterprises, by the way, I'm also going to like hit on like just employees. So like, as an employee, as a fresh-faced data scientist, you shouldn't just be going for what the highest salary is. And if you do, that's fine. But then don't blame us when you've been doing 2 years in Java trying to solve production issues, and then you move on to your next role and you find out like, oh, I've not done anything of ML. There's a bit of principle-driven decisioning that needs to be taken on both sides, right? So it's not just point the finger at, it's easy to sort of berate the sort of enterprise, but it works both ways. And so if we want to fix this, we kind of need to first acknowledge that there's a problem. But then people say, oh, the fintech industry is amazing. It's absolutely dominating in London. We've got so much turnover of new companies. But the graveyards are just as big, right? So I've met a lot of CTOs and CEOs who went down with the ship precisely because of those bad practices. The one thing that they all have in common is they never blame it on leadership. They always blame it on it wasn't our fault, it was market conditions or something like that, right? So we're going to segue a little bit, but I just wanted to sort of get that first point across, right? So there's a leadership, like before we go down and look at other ways that we can boost the market and things and boost technologies that are out there, it's like we need to address the issue of leadership. But you'll see this problem is systemic everywhere. So this is actually a good thing, right? So people can think of this as a bad thing. It's actually really a good thing because that's just like branches and call centers, right? Because they're actually hiring in other areas. This is just what really mature automation looks like. They're like a 100-year-old company, right? So like this isn't endemic of all companies. Like automation almost always increases headcount. This is just what good automation looks like. But over the same time period, to try and sort of dispel these fallacies, right? The market preference for people who use banking has moved towards mobile. And so you may look at the previous graph and go, aha, there was a technological revolution. And it's like, nah, not really. It's just the product matured. And what's even more important is user adoption, user threshold of consumer threshold adoption. Am I getting this wrong? Adoption threshold, yeah, is really high here, right? So people here want mature services. They want it to just work. Whereas when I work in China, people are much more willing to part with their data for more superior services. So the element here is like you've got to bear in mind, like for the vendors here, is there is a bit of a time lag. Like we're really slow to adopt, but that's not a bad thing. It's just because we're a bit cautious. And then the other sort of like things to bear in mind is like automation will reduce headcount eventually, but initially it'll increase headcount. And AI, like the AI ML, always increases headcount, always. Because you might think, yeah, it's going to optimize, but what you're going to do is you're going to deploy it, you're going to scale it, you're going to meet demand, you're going to build up the front end and things, and then eventually somebody's going to copy the idea. You've got market competition, so now you need to improve it, right? So you're just going to be employing more staff as you build arms and legs. So it's really good. It's just don't base your ROIs on unfounded gains. But the market is really good. But I kind of like made this because I get this question all the time. So I think it's really important just to like spell it out. So it's unlikely investing in the blue areas. Like you're not going to automate leadership anytime soon. But equally, like things like HR and mobile's been done to death. So where you want to focus on are more like the orange areas in general, right? Because that's where there's land grabs still to be made. If you're like a small startup, this is where you've got a potential to build your brand. Obviously, look at the slides after. I don't have a lot of time to sort of go through them all, but hopefully you guys are still with me just now, because now I'm going to sort of like segue more into stories and sort of tell you examples that I've seen. So this one is, don't worry too much about the diagram. Just look at the colourful boxes, right? So imagine like you've got like a bank or a fintech company, and you've got a fraud unit, so that's the red box. And then you've got the cards team, that's the blue box. You've got a loans team, that's the green box, and the yellow box is just a backup of the fraud database. Now what's happening here is the cards team come along and they go, oh, we need fraud data, because how are we going to cancel cards? Almost always what happens is the fraud team, they're very sacred about their data lake, and they say, nah, there's an 8-month application. We don't want your developers just dropping tables. So rather than do that, what they do is they create their own one, and they create a backup of the fraud database. That's what the yellow one is. The yellow is just like, it's like a 15-minute pulled data lake. But then the loans team come along, and they say, yeah, but we need to approve loans, so we also need fraud data. And then they call up the fraud team who say, get lost, right? And so they also have the same problem. Either wait 12 months, or they can consume the yellow database. So usually what happens is they'll contact the blue team, maybe an apprentice or like a misinformed project manager will say, yeah, sure, here's the connection string. Use our yellow database because we'll get more pats on the back. We've reduced risk and increased redundancy. So I don't know if any data scientists here can see what the problem is, but essentially what happens is the blue team at some point make a change. Right? That yellow table is their kind of backup, kind of like their clone of something that they should never have made. And then the green team, all of their services fall over. So they can no longer issue loans. So what you get here is you get the data swamp. So you've probably heard the data swamp. That's how it happens. You'll get like them breaching SLAs, and then you'll get like emergency budget put in to try and fix that, which then wipes out the profits of the company. There may be some senior data engineers here who kind of say to me, yeah, but Adam, that's just the story of the golden source. But no, not really, because in this example that I've seen in multiple instances is usually the result of people being so sacred about the golden source in the first place. They saw the train crash coming, but it happened anyway. So what should have happened was, and this is the point I'm here, I'm giving solutions, not just problems, is obviously the fraud team, they should never have done that in the first place. They should never have made something so sacred. They should have created like a streamlined consumer process for their real-time fraud data. But equally, like the cards team, like they should have done their due diligence. If they were going to make a backup, they should never have like shared it with everyone unless they were willing to take ownership. And then equally, right, like the green team, they should have just thought twice before trying to cut corners and cut costs. So maybe from a more of like an engineering point of view, you might say, yeah, just don't optimize something that should never be there in the first place. So let's talk about a couple more solutions, right? So I'm going to talk about one that's like if you've not got money, and then I've got one which is if you've got a lot of money. So like 4 years ago, I met a guy at a conference, and he kind of blew my mind with his talk. They didn't have a lot of cash, but they wanted to create a challenger bank. So what they did was they were like, okay, we're going to just template our whole infrastructure. So DevOps guys will know this. But it kind of lit a fire up under them. They're like, maybe we could like template like our like business logic and maybe compliance, and then maybe we could do that with like loans and customer acquisition. And so very quickly they had like an archive of scripts where they were able to sort of like have lots of knobs where they could adjust everything, like people, process, and tools, and it allowed them to respond really quickly to change. Now, I don't know if they died or not. I didn't keep up with them, but I thought it was a very innovative idea that you might want to resurrect in times like these. But equally, in times like these, there's the other option. So I met the head of DevOps at a rework conference in Houston in America. And, you know, Walmart are playing the infinite game. They've got lots of money, and they're not going to die anytime soon. So he was like, yeah, everyone's going to cloud, so I don't think we're going to do that. I think what we're going to do is we're going to put all of our chips in. And he was making a gambit that the improvement curve that AWS would offer over the next 5 years, they predicted, would not match the value that he would have and their team would have by owning their own infrastructure, building their teams organically, having the services in-house so that they wouldn't be cut out of the market. So you might be saying to me, okay, Adam, but like I don't have millions to spend on infra. But equally, you may already have some servers, right? Or just simply the message really here is just be cloud agnostic. Be ready to jump ship, especially in this up-and-coming market. Because like, if you think of the AWS or Azure S-curve, right, of improvement curve, that's actually further dampened now because there's like a supply chain issue. And it's highly unlikely that all of the chips are all of a sudden just going to flow freely out of the fabrication labs in Taiwan. So more likely what's going to happen is those high-end services that are going to keep coming in, they're just going to get more and more and more expensive. And so it may be worth you to revisit the CapEx and OpEx trade-off. So for those who don't know what CapEx and OpEx means, it just means the cost of owning your own infrastructure versus renting it. Okay, so this is a bit more data-related, a bit more with a security spin on it. So hopefully I'm kind of ticking off a few boxes here. Netflix, like 12 years ago, they did a competition, and they were like, if you can build us a model, a classifier, I mean, back then it was like really simple, but they were like, if you can build us a classifier, we'll give you $1 million. But what happened was the team who came second, they were like professors from MIT, so you would think they would be like good citizens, but they're like, nah, we're not going to be good citizens. They took all of that data and de-anonymized it and published it online. It was one of the biggest data breaches of the time. It was like users' name, addresses, the movie ratings that they like, right? So all of that sort of stuff. And so it was pretty horrific, to be honest. But again, I'm going to give you a solution. I just want to sort of get across that your counter to my point might be like, dude, that was like 12 years ago. Like, we just encrypt our models now. It's like, no, because even encrypting your models, I can do a public-private compare of your models and use a thing such as like mean average distance between your data sets on your rows in your data frame, and I can backwards engineer some values. Because you've got common technologies, you're probably using PyTorch or something like that. So the way that you combat this is, I'm not selling anything, I'm just representing myself here and sharing ideas, is you need to learn differential privacy. So for any ML engineers or data scientists, like, you cannot rely on the cyber team to protect you, because they don't even know this exists, right? They don't know that you can passively de-anonymize models. You have to learn differential privacy. But you're in luck, because one of the main guys, Andrew Trask, he lives in London, he's a Londoner, he's got a lot of material. So Andrew Trask, differential privacy, check him out. Or Cynthia Dwork, I think from America, she sort of created all of this. So that's a solution. I think I've got two more use cases, and then I'm kind of going to wrap up. But this one's more general, more easier for people to digest. This is a classic, right? So this is an Elon Musk mess up that he did. And it's funny because it doesn't get a lot of airtime, and a lot of the videos got removed from YouTube. Essentially what happened was they had to meet their production ramp for 4 or 5 years ago, and they had to get X amount of Teslas out the door, because if they couldn't pay off their loans, and then obviously they go bankrupt. So they couldn't make the profit to pay off their loans. So what he did was he called up Japan and Germany and said, I'm going to pay a few billion, can you give me your robotic arms? And they said, sure, but we don't think it's going to do what you think it's going to do. And he's like, nah, it'll be fine. And so he bought these robotic arms, and he thought his team could zoop them up to 200%. Now, bear in mind, at this time, he'd started to lay off his workforce, right? So just spoiler alert, this resulted in him crying on the factory floor, and it wasn't like a PR scandal. It was like him having a mental breakdown, because what he'd done was he'd cut his staff. was so sure that the automation would take over it, but actually you'll see videos of like these arms like swinging around at like 200 miles per hour, like knocking employees out the way. And so obviously it totally was a total catastrophe. So again, they got on the phones and they were calling up the staff they just fired and go like, hey, how's it going, right? And so, but they did it. They got the people in because Tesla's a big company and they got thousands of employees. They created big, massive tents on the side to create a fifth line. And they got the guys in, they were doing all-nighters and they got them out the door. So this resulted in him tweeting, humans are underrated. And you kind of feel like saying, yeah, because we underrated them. And so really the sort of moral of the story here is for like startups, CEOs, innovation incubators. Like you cannot base your ROI on any form of automation or AI gains that have not been tested. It's as simple as that. It's like you're like, Adam, you're saying all this simple, basic stuff. And it's like, yeah, but the mistakes keep happening. You know, it's like we keep saying to people like, automation is not going to save your company in the next couple of days. So that's where we are. And I think like, I'm going to finish off on this use case. This is the last use case. And this is for vendors out here, right? So I think there's a few vendors in here. And my advice to vendors or like people looking to pick up clients is like, rather than look for like what big banks need, which you do need to do anyway, is you need to study more positive use cases. Because in this market, right, you need to look at like what's really, really good. Right? And Thought Machine, what they did was amazing. I met their CEO, I think I did a panel with him, really, really switched on guy. He was like an ex-Google employee and he had this idea when a lot of people thought it was taboo. And you know, by the time that they signed a contract with Lloyd's, it was just a formality because they were milestone driven, they weren't pushy, they were transparent, they kind of met the thresholds that was required of them. But to spin that around as advice, like if I would give advice, I would say like looking at these use cases, and I've been evaluating partnerships for years now. It's like if I tell you a problem and you say to me, yeah, we can do that. Oh, Sarah, she can do that, or Bob, he's really good at that. That's making me worry. If I propose a problem and you offer a solution, and your solution is like completely different from what I just asked, or it only overlaps with like 50%, what that's telling me is you cast a really wide net, right? And I'm just the first fish to bite, and now you're pivoting towards me. So the way I would advise big enterprises how to look out for that is do not let your engineers talk to their sales team, at least until your engineers have done their due diligence. And the way that works is you say, okay, your engineers talk to their engineers, and you look at their website and you do a cross-reference, right? So if all of the bullet points that are on their website of their offerings, if their engineers are like, then you know they're not, because sales move at light speed, right? And engineers move at snail speed. So it's just really, final point there is like, yeah, fair play. You're not going to get a solution for everyone, right? That's it. That's business, right? You have to take a risk. You have to go with what you believe, and that's why you have to play the infinite game. But if you're honest, at least I'm more likely to be like, that product's really good. It doesn't do what I want, but I might ask you and say, how much effort would it take you to pivot to me? So it's far better to be honest than to be dishonest and then ruin a relationship and then ruin your company brand. So I'm actually going to finish up here because I appreciate I'm talking a lot, but I will finish up and just cover the Blockbuster one because it's just too good to not cover. So essentially the Blockbuster CEO, he saw Netflix was coming, right? They're not stupid. Like they weren't like, oh, Netflix, oh, we're done now. They basically, he went to the board and he said, look, we really need to consider the subscription model here because the market's changed, which is what's happening now. And he said, I really think we need to consider the subscription model. And the board said, nah, don't think so, because 12% of our revenue comes from late fees. So they were so obsessed about that revenue and their late fees that they weren't willing to play the infinite game and pivot and adapt to the market, and now they're dead. So I appreciate, like, it's not like a really positive sort of talk, but the thing I want to get across here is, like, if anything, like, it's just like the primitive stuff, the primitive human brain stuff is like, if in this climate you are waiting to see which horse pulls ahead before you're backing them, you're done, right? Because by the time that the first ship finally pulls ahead, they've already got 5 or 6 years of maturity ahead of you. You need to focus on product maturity. You need to focus on being loyal to your staff. As staff, you need to be picking a horse and trying to stay there for 2, 3, 4, 5 years and building up experience. So I think moving forward, it's a principle-driven marketplace, and that's kind of how I see things. It's like ethics and principle is going to allow your company to survive, and I think I'm out of time, so thank you.